Okay, so I want to thank you all for joining us today. I'm Carrie Jones. I'm the Administrative Technical Director for the Coaching Education and Player Development Department at NCUSA. And we have Leah Washington here with us. Leah is an assistant professor in athletic training and sports psychology at Bridgewater College. She has experience working with athletes at all levels of competition, from youth to professional. Her undergraduate degree is in athletic training from James Madison University. She holds a master's degree in exercise physiology from the George Washington University and a PhD in sports psychology from University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Her research includes the psychological recovery of injured athletes, use of sports psychology skills by athletic trainers, and readiness of athletic training students to incorporate psychosocial skills in clinical practice. In addition to teaching, she regularly consults with athletes and teams to improve their mental game. And on that note, she's going to talk to us today about motivation and what it is really. What are the different components of motivation and what do they mean? She will define what motivation is, teach us about some of the theories behind it, and she will share some steps so we can create a climate that encourages the right kinds of motivation in our athletes. So with that said, Miss Leah.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to talk to you today about motivation. It's one of my favorite topics. So as Carrie said, I'm going to talk a little bit about, what we think motivation is, because it seems sometimes it's kind of a little nebulous, but we don't really know how to quite define what we mean when we say it. It's one of those like, well, I know what it is when I see it. But there's actually a fair amount of research and we have a pretty good understanding about what motivation is, the different parts of it. I will go over some actual theory about it today. And I like to talk about the background because sometimes I think even if we can't remember like the specific steps we need to take, if we understand the theory, we can kind of reverse engineer it and apply it that way. So let's see. So basically, when we describe motivation, it has two overarching concepts, right? The direction and intensity of effort. Because a lot of times we think we talk about when people are not motivated, but what we're really saying is that it's not that you're not motivated to do something, it's that you're motivated to do something else more, right? Like, I could be motivated to run, but I'm actually more motivated to sit on my couch with my puppy dogs, right? So it's like, what are you seeking out? What are you approaching? And what are you attracted to? And then to what intensity or what degree do you engage in that direction? So you can be motivated, but just a little motivated, right? Like not a lot of intensity. So it's kind of these two parts. And we think about the different components of motivation, and we'll get into these a little bit more. One is the attitude, right? Like what we call self-efficacious, or how confident are we in the belief that we're able to do something. If we're not that confident and we don't feel like we have a lot of self-efficacy in something, we're probably not gonna be super motivated to do that thing, right? And I think this can be a challenge, especially in older individuals. Like when we start playing a sport when we're younger, right? We kind of forget that we went through the awkward phase. Like we don't remember the parts that like when we felt dumb or stupid or embarrassing. So when we try something new when we're older, then we're revisiting those feelings. I don't like them very much. We're like, no, but I've always been good at this thing. It's like, no, you haven't actually. You started out bad. We just forgot what that was like. Also metacognition. So this is where things like goal setting comes into play. So this is the plan. So first of all, it's what are we attracted to? What are we motivated towards, right? What is the direction? And then how specifically are we going to get there? We can be really super motivated to do something, but if we don't know how to go about doing it, it's going to be really difficult to stay motivated, right? And we can talk about goal setting a whole other thing, a whole other lecture on that if we want to do that. But talking about what are our short-term goals, what are our long-term goals, what are our process goals, and then how have we planned for contingencies? How have we planned for setbacks? Do we run up against a barrier and then give up because we don't have anything? We didn't think ahead enough on how to deal with that, and we didn't plan ahead, and that can really get in the way of our motivation. And then what is our drive, right? Where does the energy come from? And a lot of times, and I think I mentioned this in my original lecture, that our energy comes from our values. What do we think is important? If it's not something that we value, right, then it's not going to be something that we're going to put a lot of thought or energy into. And we're just going to be like, it's not that important to us, so therefore we're not going to be super motivated to do it. And so this is where we start to get into, what happens when, if our only motivation is winning, well, what happens when winning isn't an option? What happens when we're playing an opponent who is head and shoulders above us? What happens when we're the underdog and that's not an option? What other goals do we have? And I'll talk about that, those choices between, winning mindsets and things like that in a bit. So one of the major theoretical underpinnings of motivation is called the self-determination theory. It was developed at the University of Rochester in the mid-1980s by DC and Ryan. And basically what their kind of idea is that in order to be, so they have this scale of self-determination continuum, being completely amotivated, not interested, don't care, don't want to do anything, all the way to being completely intrinsically motivated. You're doing it because you love it, and that's being completely self-determined, right? That's why it's called the self-determination theory. So it's got three parts to it: competence, relatedness, and autonomy. And this is sort of at the baseline, at the individual level. One, so we mentioned that self-efficacy thing before, right? How do we perceive our ability to perform a task or take initiative? How competent do we feel? The second component is relatedness. Do we feel that we belong to a group, or do we believe that we are participating in something that is greater than ourselves, right? So I might train for a 5K by myself, but maybe I'm doing it for as a fundraiser, right? So that would be, I'm still feeling this relatedness to this larger cause, right? So it can be either being part of a team, or it can be sort of this, larger sense of connectedness. And then autonomy is, do you have the ability to make decisions? Do you have the ability to regulate your own choices within the activity that you're doing? I think we've all been in a situation where we have no autonomy and we're just being told what to do, and we have no sort of agency, right, of our own, and that sucks. We don't like being just a cog in the wheel. We don't like being a situation where we can't control the outcome ourselves. So we have to create a space for that autonomy. And it may be that we, provide within so like, for example, when I work with an athlete in injury rehabilitation, there isn't a whole lot, it's not going to be a free-for-all, right? Like, there's very specific protocols that I have to follow, but within that protocol, I can give them choices, right? Like, I can say, you have to do, 30 minutes of cardio. Do you want to do X, Y, or Z cardio, right? So within the constraints of that, I can create opportunities for that autonomy and those individual decision-making or individual choices. So whenever one of these social factors whether that's because you have an overbearing coach, whether that's because you don't feel like you're a part of the team, whether it's because you moved up a level and now you don't feel very competent in something, motivation is at risk for declining. And so this is sort of just the spectrum of all the different ways in which we can be motivated. And I won't go into them specifically because you have the chart there, but we can think about, like, are we motivated, you know, so that we don't get punished, right? That would be the external regulation, right? Am I doing it just so that I don't get in trouble? Or am I doing it because I'm going to get a reward? Or am I doing this because it's going to serve a greater purpose, right? This is where we get into that identified regulation, where it's like, I don't want to go for a run, but I know that it will make me a better soccer player, and I value being a good soccer player, so I'm going to go for the run, right? I'm not motivated to run. I'm actually motivated to be a good soccer player, but I know that running is in service of this greater thing, right? And so you can kind of move up the continuation of the self-determination continuum. I also really like the achievement goal theory, which some of you may have heard of, especially if you are educators. So basically thinking about what does it take to be successful, and how do we determine what success means? And there can be several, you know, everybody can have different definitions of success, right? And so it's really important to think about who has what definition of success and who has what definition of failure, and it can be different for different people. And so are we oriented, so we'll talk about goal orientation and perceived ability, right? And that will translate into the behavior. Do they participate or not? Do they put forth effort into the activity or not? So just like we can have lots of different motivations in terms of self-determination, you know, we can also have lots of different successes, right? For some people, winning might be the only definition of success. For other people, it might be having fun or being part of a group. For other people, it might be learning a new task, right, would be considered successful. And it's important to recognize that we all have multiple motivations and multiple definitions of success, right? That, you know, I'm not going to sit here and say that winning doesn't matter, right? I work with athletes every single day. Of course, winning matters, but it can't be the only definition of success that we have. And we'll see that when we have other definitions of success, we're actually more likely to have the outcome be what we want it to be, rather than focusing on just wins and losses. So when we talk about our goal orientation, right? Is someone ego-oriented, task-oriented, or social-oriented? Ego-oriented individuals are very focused on comparing yourself to other people, right? Their motivation is to be better than other people. So there's lots of comparisons happening. And this is somebody who's really, really focused on wins and losses. Someone who is task-oriented, they tend to compare themselves to themselves, right? Did they do better than they did yesterday or last season, or you know, at a previous level? So they're always comparing themselves to their own past performances, right? Like, these are the people who are really looking for PRs, who are looking for new skills and that kind of thing. And then, are they motivated socially? You know, how are they perceived within a group? What is their affiliation level? And being a part of the group and being liked by the people in the group is a lot of their main orientation. And you see this a lot in younger kids who are more skewed to, they want to be with their friends, right? And they want to hang out with their friends. What we know is that individuals who are task or mastery oriented, they tend to persist in the face of a challenge much more readily than someone who is an ego-oriented person. That when faced with a challenge, people who are task-oriented, they're more likely to stick with it. that they're more likely to persist, that they're more likely, that because their motivation is about self-improvement, that they're more likely to stay the course. So the other part of achievement goal theory is this idea of a fixed versus a growth mindset. And this was developed by a researcher named Carol Dweck. She's out at Stanford. I think she's still teaching. I don't know, she's been around for a really long time. This is one of my favorite books. It's really great. It's got a ton of good information. I think all coaches should read this book. But one of the main parts of it is this idea between an entity view and an incremental focus, or a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. Individuals who have an entity view believe that ability is what it is, that you are smart or you're not smart, you're talented or you're not talented. Whereas an incremental focus or a growth mindset focuses on hard work and effort. So like if, for example, if I had a kid in front of me and they had a really good grade on a test, and I said, oh my gosh, you did so well, you must be really smart, right? That would be taking on an entity view, right? You did well because you have this entity, or you have this trait about you, right? Whereas if I said, oh my gosh, you did so well on that test, you must have worked really hard for that grade, right? Then that emphasizes the fact that they had control over the outcome, right? And that maybe they got a B on the test, but if they worked maybe a little bit harder, maybe they could get an A, right? And that, you know, and we'll revisit this idea of having fixed versus growth mindset. And also whether or not we're approach goal oriented or avoidance goal oriented. Are we looking at achieving, or are we looking at avoiding failure, right? And we will want to focus on that achievement or approach goal orientation. That's what we're really looking for. So where do we come in as coaches? Well, we can actually influence the climate of our practices, right? And the culture of our team by emphasizing one or the other, right? And I'm sure that all of us have worked with coaches, either had coaches that ourselves or seen other coaches, where they really focus this ego performance climate, right? They're really focused on winning. They're very focused on the outcome, and being sort of, you know, focused on mistakes, right? That these errors and comparing players to other players, and why can't you be like this player, creates rivalries and creates division between teams. And what ends up happening is that when we become overly focused on the outcome, right, sort of this ends justifies the means, that a lot of our players will be really, really anxious. We get nervous about competing because we don't want to fail. We get nervous because we think we're going to get into trouble. And it's not satisfying. It's not fun. It sucks. It's not a great environment to be in, right? But if we focus on creating a motivational climate that is task oriented, then, and we are focused on personal progress, right? That we really lean into like the development of skills and not just showing off the skills, and we encourage cooperation between team members, that enjoyment, satisfaction go up, and we often come out on top, right? The outcome will happen if we do these other things. But if we only focus on the outcome, we're not going to be as successful. It's almost a little bit counterintuitive that way. That if we focus on, and this is kind of what we mean when we talk about, you know, take one, you know, shot at a time, or be in the moment, right? If we focus on the task at hand, then the outcome is much more likely to happen what we want. And also when we work with younger kids, especially in that sort of like 9 to 12-ish 9 to 13-ish age range, right? This is where we see a lot of attrition of kids, dropping out of sport, that they don't want to play anymore. And most of the time, almost entirely, it's because it's not fun anymore, right? That's usually their main motivation for playing sport in the first place. And it's not that they can't do it, it's just that it's not enjoyable anymore. And if we can continue to create this motivational climate that's focused on development and that's focused on cooperation, it's a much more enjoyable experience, and we're actually much more likely to retain those kids for a lot longer. And even beyond, some of this, like, whether or not they're competitive, it just leaves them so that they don't hate activity, right? That when you have a kid who left because activity wasn't fun and because sport wasn't fun, the chances of them becoming active later in life also go down, right? So there are a lot of unintended consequences that can happen because of this. And there's lots and lots of research supporting a task mastery climate over an ego performance climate. So what does this tell us about what we need to do and how we understand motivation? So when we look at high achievers versus low achievers, we can compare, and we see that these high achievers, they have that achievement motivation in terms of they approach success, right? That they want to achieve success, and they're much more focused on that. They're less focused on failure. They're less focused on losing. And what I always find it so interesting, you hear interviews with professional athletes a lot of times, and they're just like, oh man, I hate losing so much. I just hate losing, right? And they think that that's their main motivator. But like, find me a competitive athlete that enjoys losing. That's like not a thing. There's no athlete out there who's like, oh yeah, losing is super fun. I really love that journey for me. That doesn't make any sense, right? So this idea of like hating losing is actually not super helpful, I think, for any high achieving athlete, right? That they are working so hard to achieve success that they end up avoiding failure. And that their primary emotion around that is feeling good about being successful, right? They have pride, and that kind of goes into that self-efficacy, right? That they feel good about doing well, right? And when they talk about their success, right, that they ascribe it to factors that are within their control, right? And when I say here, success is stable and internal factors, what that means is that these are factors that are internal to themselves, that they have control over, and that they're pretty stable from moment to moment, right? That it doesn't matter which competition it is, it doesn't matter what point in the season it is, that they have these traits of theirs are very stable over time. And that if they lose, or they have however they define failure, that's ascribed to something that was outside of their control. It's something else that happened. And that could be it could be a fluke weather thing, it could be bad calls from refs, whatever it is, it's not something that they had control over. So they typically, high achievers, like we mentioned before, they typically adopt incremental and task goals. They have high perceived competence, right? That goes back to that self-determination theory. And they seek out challenges. And for somebody who's a high achiever, the best possible scenario is a 50-50 outcome, right? That it could go either way. And research has shown this over and over and over again, where they like that they have to work for it, right? It's not a guarantee win, that they want the challenge, they look for that. And so that 50-50 could go either way kind of scenario is actually an ideal situation for somebody who is a high achiever. And they typically do well when they're in an evaluative condition, right? When they're in a competition, they tend to do better. People who are low achievers, that they are much more motivated to avoid failure, right? That they don't want to look stupid, that they are trying to they want situations in which it's almost guaranteed that they're going to win, right? Their primary emotion, instead of looking for this idea of pride and competence, that they're really focused on shame and worry, that they are terrified of looking like a failure. They're terrified of being a failure, and it's a very shameful way to be. So they often talk about, when they talk about their successes, they frame that as sort of like the fluke. That's the crazy thing that happened, right? Where it's like, yeah, I mean, we just had a good day and calls went our way and the crowd was really behind us, and they start talking about all these external things that they didn't have control over. And I see this over and over and over again in athletes, where if you ask them, tell me about a time when things didn't go the way you wanted them to go, they can tell you in minute, very specific detail of all the things that they did wrong. And it's always their fault when things went wrong. And they can give you minute by minute replay of the thing that went wrong. And then if you ask them to describe something that went really well, they're like, I mean, it was a thing that happened, and it was like this magical moment, right? They're like, how could you recreate that, right? And so that seems to be out of their control. So when I say that failure becomes stable and internal, right? That they're the ones who are responsible for the failure. External factors are responsible for the win. Whereas somebody who's a high achiever, the opposite is true. So low achievers, they are very focused on that outcome. Ironically enough, that they are less focused on that task mastery orientation. They have low perceived competence because of that, that they avoid challenges, or so where a high achiever looks for a 50-50, could go either way situation, a low achiever will look for either a guaranteed win or a guaranteed loss. So they will often choose things in which you would think that they would underperform, but because they know what the outcome is, that they can kind of prepare for it. And a lot of that, because their main emotion is shame and worry, having the predetermined outcome is a source of self-preservation against that negative emotion, right? So that they can prepare for, if it's a guaranteed win, then they can feel good that they're going to be a winner, right? And if it's a guaranteed loss, then they can prepare in their mind how to mitigate, like, oh, well, I mean, like, what was I going to do? There was nothing I could have done, right? There was no amount of effort or whatever that could have changed the outcome, right? Because it's very stable. So they look for those moments that have that sort of like, they already know the ending before they've even started. And again, we think like, oh, like when we think about like the emotional component of it, right? We forget that what they're really ultimately doing is they're really trying to protect themselves, right, from feeling those negative emotions. Because if you are a high achiever and you try and you lose, right, that's devastating and that sucks. And we don't like to feel like that. However, if you can frame it in your mind as, I played a really good game and I did all the things, right? If I'm task oriented, if I ran a PR or if I did skills that I had been working on for a long time and I did them well and I still ended up losing, I can still feel successful in that outcome, right? Because I have all of this other stuff built into it of how I define success. And then we see that in those high achievers, right? And but we've also seen the players who they could have had the best game of their life, but it doesn't matter because they lost, right? And that's all the only thing that they're focused on. And so again, it kind of goes all the way back to how do we define success? So what do we do with this information, right? How can we recreate these environments? So here's some 4 guidelines for building motivation. And we'll go through each one of these. So 1, to understand that the situation and the trait both motivate people, right? That we have multiple motivations or multiple motives, and that we can change our environment and we can change our orientation to enhance motivation. And then we can use behavior modification. So 1, we want to consider both situations and psychological traits, right? So the social factors, you know, and this kind of goes to that need achievement theory, right? How focused are we on success and failure, and how do we define success and failure within our team? How do we focus on, how much focus is there on competition versus cooperation within our team? What is the coach behavior? And, you know, just what is the general climate, right? Like what kind of climate are we creating? Are we creating that motivational climate that is task oriented, or are we creating a motivational climate that is ego or outcome oriented, right? Then we have our psychological mediators, and this is where that self-determination theory comes in, right? How confident do we feel? How related do we feel? And what kind of autonomy do we have? And then we can look at sort of that continuum of amotivated or really motivated to do something else, really all the way to intrinsic motivation. I would do this for free. I would do this because I love it so much and nothing would ever stop me, right? Then we look at the consequences of the social factors plus the psychological factors and the motivation, and that translates into the affect, behavior, and cognitions, right? The affect is our emotions. How do we feel about the situation, right? Are we trying to avoid shame? Are we seeking out pride? Do we enjoy being there? All of those things. What kind of behaviors, and this is usually what we pick up on the most as coaches, right? Are they putting forth effort? Do they show up? Do they show up on time? Do they stay the whole time? Do they help their teammates? What kind of, you know, feedback are they giving their friends, right? What kind of things are they saying while they're at practice? All of those behaviors will indicate sort of where they're falling on this motivational spectrum, right? And then what cognitions do they have? What do they think about, you know, practice? What do they think about the sport? What do they think about, you know, what is their self-talk? You know, what are they telling themselves? What are they saying to other people? You know, so I think that it's not so much, you know, we talk a lot about, oh, this isn't a priority for this person, or that person's not motivated to do it. Well, why not? What are they motivated to do, right? And why? And are we as coaches contributing to that motivation, right? That this isn't kind of when we think about that growth and fixed mindset, right? If we are focused on like, well, that kid's talented, right? Well, at some point, everybody's talented, right? So when you see, actually, I'm going to talk about that in a second. We also have to understand that there are lots of different reasons that people, especially kids, are involved in sport, right? That part of it is going to be their friendship, which is actually, because we know about the self-determination theory, is really important, that relatedness component. That we have all kinds of different motivations for being involved in something. And sometimes those motivations can even compete, right? That they can kind of work against each other. That if we have difficulty prioritizing or our conflicts, that can be a real challenge as well. You know, and it could be something as simple as asking them to write down why are they participating, and you know, and do that for everybody. Say what do we want to get out of this, you know, team? What do we want to, you know, why are we even here? Is it because we want to have fun? Great motivation. Is it because we want to play soccer because we love soccer? Perfect, great motivation, right? We can also change our environment, and this is where especially our roles as coaches is super important, right? And we talk about that motivational climate, that we want to provide both competitive and recreational opportunities. Because again, I'm not going to sit here and deny the fact that winning isn't, you know, important. That otherwise we wouldn't seed tournaments, we wouldn't have tournaments, right? That winning is for a lot of reasons why people get into it, but again, it cannot be the only reason. And if we have this other motivation, this task mastery motivation, winning becomes way more likely to happen in the first place. We need to be able to adjust to different individuals who have different motivations, and to remember that we as coaches are part of the environment, right? That the things that we say and the cognitions and behaviors and affect that we bring to practice every day influence kids just as much. And then to think about how we choose our captains. A lot of times captains are chosen because they're the best athlete and not necessarily because they're the best leader. And so when you think about how you want to choose a captain, is it going to be entirely voted on by the team? Are you going to have some input? You know, are you going to rank them on certain other skills like leadership skills, and how do they embody that task mastery environment and that motivational climate that you want to foster, right? That can be really important. And then lastly, right, we can use our behavior change, right? That we can really focus on positive reinforcement and giving constructive feedback, rather than being punitive in the feedback that we're giving. That we talked a little bit about this, I think, in our other talk on focus, of like, okay, so if you want somebody to focus, then constructively give them, you know, direction on how to do that. We want to reinforce the behaviors that we want to have continue, and sort of downplay the behaviors that we don't want, right? And so ultimately, we want to recognize that their personal motivations or situational factors, all of that is going to influence behavior. That we want to emphasize those task goals. So we want to emphasize comparison to the athlete the day before, rather than the athlete to other athletes. So we want to downplay that ego orientation. We want to create that task motivational climate. You know, when you work with kids in younger age groups, right, that their development as players is sort of a wide range, right? And that you have some kids who do certainly have a natural affinity for whatever activity that you're engaging in. So in this case, if you have a kid who's like sort of naturally good at playing soccer, right? And you have other kids who are kind of struggling with it, right? If we focus on this growth mindset, right? Because it's really easy to pick out the kids who are quote unquote talented, right? They're like, oh my gosh, that kid's talented, but he's also like 10 years old, right? So at some point, the other kids, their skill level is going to catch up to the quote unquote talented kid, right? So, but because these other kids who've had to work and because they're focused on effort, right? By the time they reach the kid who's talented, now this kid is talented plus knows how to work, right? And when we have somebody who has a fixed mindset, they're, oh, that kid's just talented, right? They won't know what to do when they're faced with a challenge, right? Because they've never had to work for it. So if we constantly emphasize effort and hard work, right, they're going to be effort, hard work plus talent, and then that's going to propel them even further, right? Because at some point, like, especially like I work with college athletes primarily, and I've worked with professional athletes as well, but at some point, like, everybody's good. Everybody's good. Like, you all made it here. So what's going to be the difference, right? And we know kids who are super talented and can kind of coast until they get to a point where now it's hard and they don't know how to deal with that, right? And if we focus on that growth mindset from the beginning and focus on overcoming challenges and feeling good when we overcome challenges and emphasize that pride, in success, right, then they're going to be much better off later on, right? And when we talk about those attributions, right, and that goes to what are the things that are stable and in their control, right? That if somebody makes a mistake, how do they attribute that mistake? Are they blaming it on somebody else? Are they blaming it on themselves? Are they too hard on themselves, right? And finding that balance between what are the things that you have under your control that you can change moving forward, right? Thinking about when to compete and when to focus on individual improvement and finding that balance within practices and having those competitive moments within practices that will help prepare them for the evaluative scenario at the end. And then building those relationships, right? That relatedness of that self-determination theory of whether that's relationships between players, relationships between you and players, building that community, right, can be really, really important for those athletes. So hopefully, I know I gave you a ton of information today, which is why I kind of had a lot of stuff on every slide, so you can kind of go back and read some of it. But I think it's important to understand why we think about motivation the way we do, and to think about the fact that it's not that we're not necessarily not motivated, but what are we motivated towards? Are we motivated to do something else? Are we motivated for self-preservation and to avoid the negative feelings that come with shame and worry? Or are we motivated towards that approach mindset, that growth mindset, that task mastery environment? And that's going to take the kids not just, in the immediacy, but that is a foundation that they will draw on for a very long time.
Thank you, Leah. That information was excellent. We do have a couple questions for you.
Great.
So the first one is, how do you suggest conveying the message of the achievement goal theory to the parents, if at all?
So I'm assuming this is some of those overzealous parents, I'm imagining. And that can be a real challenge for sure. Whereas I think originally it's kind of reinforcing the message that I also think winning is important. However, in order for winning to happen, here are the things that need to occur to have that happen, right? So again, especially when I work with these high achieving athletes, like I'm not gonna deny that winning is important, right? I was a gymnast. I competed for 10 years. I love winning. It's great, right? But if I want that to happen, I can't just focus on the win, right? I know that I have to do X, Y, and Z things. And so if we continue to focus on, great, I hear you. I have that same goal, but in order for that to occur, here's what I'm focused on, right, as a coach. And to emphasize, that, yeah, winning is important. But here are the other things that I think are important too for these kids, right? And you kind of just have to you'll sound like a broken record, and it can be really frustrating, but you kind of have to hold up party line of like, yeah, I also want to do all of these other things.
So
And
along
just repeat it over and over and over again.
right. So along that line, how often would you suggest that coaches meet with players and or parents to discuss development, to continue to motivate them and to understand the motivation of the players?
I mean, for your players, you can certainly do a couple different things. Like one, you can, at the beginning of the season, you can have a discussion about, you know, why are you even there, right? And so if you look at that continuum of self-determination, like, are they there just because their parents want them to be there, right? Then that would be a certain point. You know, are they there just because they love soccer? They're all the way on the other end. And so you can have discussion individually, and then you can have the discussion larger as a team. Like, what do you guys want to get out of this? Like, what do you, like, yeah, we want to, you know, what are our end goals? And to remind them, because sometimes they'll be like, yeah, we want to win, right? But then you say, okay, well, what about, do you guys even like soccer? Like, having fun maybe be a goal we could work towards, right? Because they forget sometimes. And then day to day, practice wise, you know, ask them, you know, what do you want to achieve today that you want to build on from yesterday? Right? That we can set daily goals and we can have them comparatively. So, okay, so we worked on this set piece yesterday. How can we make it better today? Right? And that's another way that we can foster that task mastery environment. And focus on what are our individual performances comparatively. I think for parents, it depends maybe on the group, it depends maybe on the age group. I think it's important to sort of lay out your philosophy, your achievement goal philosophy, that task mastery climate at the beginning, say this is the expectation. And then at the end of the season, when you have your end of season picnic or whatever awards ceremony, that, you know, maybe you have awards for MVP and you have your awards for points and you have all these awards, but then to have those awards of like most improved and to have, you know, your MVP, maybe they're not the ones that were the highest scores, but maybe they're the ones that had the best leadership skills, right? And so to reinforce some of those, you know, philosophies that you laid out at the beginning. Because it doesn't do any good if we say, oh yeah, we're going to do all of these task mastery, growth mindset, blah, blah, blah. And then by the end of the season, all we care about is who had the most goals, who had the most assists, who played the most minutes.
That's fair. Yeah. So we have one question regarding players, and then I have two for coach, in regards to coaches.
Right.
So for the player, how would you suggest a coach motivates a player to persevere when the player responds to disappointment or stress with physical symptoms, such as a headache or tummy ache, without the coach invalidating the player's discomfort?
Right. So one, I think it's important to acknowledge what they're feeling, right? That you can just say, it seems like I get the impression that you get really stressed out when things get hard. Am I on the right track with that? Am I reading you correctly? Right. And then they can confirm or deny that. It's like, yeah, it's, you know, and they can describe their stress. And then we can maybe incorporate ways to manage the stress level in terms of whether that's, you know, there's lots of different interventions for stress management in terms of just real easy deep breathing, changing their self-talk, incorporating some mindfulness. But I think the most important thing, the very first step, is to acknowledge and you just say to the athlete, you know, if you approach it from a place of curiosity and from a place of positive regard, of like, you know, I've noticed this happens every time that things get really stressful. Would you say that's accurate? Right? And get their read on the situation. And then think about what is stressful for them. And then maybe so we have those mental skill interventions, but then also can you create smaller moments of successes? So no, maybe they didn't, you know, score the goal, but maybe their footwork was really good, you know, or where the smaller moments and give them smaller achievements. And that's also a way to increase that self-efficacy that will help minimize some of that anxiety. So if we can create scenarios in which we not necessarily guarantee them successes, but create a scenario in which success is much more likely in smaller places, then we can build that self-efficacy, and that will ultimately minimize some of that anxiety. So it's kind of like that two-pronged approach of creating successes and then using some of these other stress management skills.
Excellent, thank you. So the last two questions I have are in regards to coaches.
Okay.
And they kind of go together. So I'm going to start with one and then follow up. How important is the coach's behavior, words, body language, interaction with referees, opposing coaches, and parents in promoting a positive motivational climate?
Incredibly important. I can't overstate how important it is.
Excellent.
I truly can't. Especially at the youth level. You have to be, as a coach, you have to be the one to model the behavior that you want from your athletes. You will completely undermine any message that you send about growth mindset, motivational climate, if you yourself are an asshole. It's not going to work. It's just not going to work.
Sure. So to follow up on that, if there is a parent or a team manager or a referee who is witnessing or hears, whether they hear it or they see it, a coach that is the antithesis of motivation, what is your suggestion for them? Do they address it? Do they let it go? Or how would they best? And thinking in terms of a player or not a player, excuse me, a coach or a manager who is witnessing another coach whose focus or the team's focus is like on retribution for a call or a foul, or they can't let something go,
right.
And they're taking it out on their team or things like that. And do you address that as a manager or another parent, or when would you address that?
That's a really tough situation. I think as a manager, you have more leverage than as a parent, honestly. I think as a parent, you can certainly bring it up. I don't know how far you'll get. But I think in terms of management and in terms of the organization, it's just as much, you know, as we go through these workshops, right, that coach development is just as important. One of the things that I find to be super useful as a manager, so yes, you want to address it. You want to state plainly the behavior that you're seeing of when this happens, this is what I'm observing, and these are the things that I'm hearing you say, right? Because that becomes much more difficult to refute than being like, you're not helping. And they're like, well, you don't know my life, right? So if you can identify very specific behaviors and very specific statements, right, that's a step in the right direction, and kind of not dispassionately, but very factually of saying, here are the things that I'm seeing, here are the things that I'm hearing. Can you tell me a little bit more about this? What was going on in that scenario, right? I also find it very useful to do like on the one hand and on the other hand. So you can say, so on the one hand, we've talked a lot about achievement motivation. We've talked a lot about creating this task mastery environment, but on the other hand, I'm seeing X, Y, and Z behaviors and statements. So can you help me understand how those two things go together? Right, so instead of saying, we're trying to do this and you're doing this and that's not working, right? Bring them into the conversation and say, like, I'm just trying to understand what's happening. Because to me, like, these things, they feel like they're going in opposite directions, but maybe I'm not quite getting what's really happening, right? And that's going to be a much more productive conversation with the coach than you need to do this and you need to do that. Especially when you think about, right, our self-determination theory, if we're taking away that autonomy to make decisions as a coach, it's not going to work, right? So how can we bring that coach in to then say, right, that does seem counterintuitive and not helpful.
Give them time to self-reflect.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. Excellent. Well, Leah, that's all the questions that I have. There were several questions asking for copies of the slides, which you have shared with me in a PDF format, so I will share those. And then we have recorded this session, so we will put that recording up on our website in the next day or so for people to view. But Leah, thank you so much for your time. We look forward to having you back in the future. And thank you everybody for signing on today.
My pleasure.